The average person is very conservative by disposition. Although they might espouse progressive or liberal political ideology, and although they might advocate for lifestyle choices that no traditional society would uphold, still, the way that they come into their views tends to be by being inculcated into them by some authority figure or by seeing them exhibited in their peer group. People are naturally conformist. They are reluctant to really think for themselves and think in original ways. People don't want to also spend the effort to examine the theoretical priors underlying a perspective, weigh up the evidence and arguments on all sides, and come to a coherent, independent, rational judgment. It's costly to do that, and most people recognize they're not particularly good at it anyway, so you might as well just defer to existing political notions. Even political extremists are conservative in the sense that they go for existing, established extremist ideologies. When someone is good with critical thinking, very often they still won't choose to engage in independent, original political thought because, well, what's the payoff? The number one thing that people do with political ideology on an everyday basis is to signal their tribal identity. People tend to come up with their opinions by averaging over the opinions of their peers, adjusted for their relative status. They identify an in-group that they want to be a part of because it might confer reproductive benefits or economic benefits or status or just a feeling of belonging. And for those kind of instinctual reasons, they begin conforming their views to the views of the high-status members of that in-group, the average members of that in-group, so that they fit in and have a community to belong to. That's the number one thing people do with political ideology. So if you think for yourself, even if you're right, it doesn't necessarily benefit you because all you manage to do is deprive yourself of a tribe. If you're the only person who believes what you believe, well, then you can't signal membership and you can't benefit from an already established in-group. So why bother? The reason, though, to bother doing it is that the large-scale society, which does foster the cultivation of original, radical political thought, is the large-scale society that will find the new paths forward, which occasionally open up due to technological change or environmental change. You know, the herd will tend to calculate at scale. The collective intelligence of the herd will find the best practices in most domains. And so it's generally a bad idea to deviate all that much from the done thing. But the world changes, technology changes, and sometimes deviating from the norm and breaking out of that conservative mentality affords advantages. You find the new ecological niche. You find the new survival strategy, and your group benefits. Agriculture was invented around 12,000 years ago. And for the previous 30,000 years, people had larger brains than we have today. They made sophisticated, abstract, and representational art that we have a hard time reproducing. They had fine textiles, they hunted with bows and arrows, they were doing deep-sea fishing. These were hyper-competent, hyper-intelligent individuals who thrived in a world that we probably wouldn't survive day one in. These were very intelligent people, but for tens of thousands of years, none of them thought of taking a seed, which is something they encountered on a daily basis, and putting it in the soil to intentionally cultivate useful plants. The concept of agriculture eluded very intelligent people for tens of thousands of years. Not because there was some hard technological limit preventing it, not because there were hard environmental limits preventing it, just because it wasn't the conventional thing. Of course, European populations in the Ice Age probably could not have feasibly exploited agriculture, but big-brained, sophisticated populations in North Africa and the Levant were already using the basic grains that became the early domesticates. So they knew these plants, they lived in environments where these plants could have been cultivated, but they didn't do it. Probably for a similar reason that, people don't engage in independent political thought, because what's the payoff? These plants grow naturally. It takes effort to try to cultivate them. Why bother? No one saw the long-term benefits. Urbanization. The first city in the world, Çatalhöyük, didn't involve some new architectural technique. They were doing the same stuff in home building that they had done for thousands of years prior. They just packed the houses more closely together, probably because they were pressed into it from warfare or an environmental crisis, who knows. But once they started living in this way, all of a sudden, all of these unpredictable emergent benefits started accruing. They had a leisure class. People could spend time thinking and innovating, developing new technologies. There was intense division of labor, and that increased the efficiency of their economy. And probably no one saw all of those benefits coming, but once they changed their way of life, they accessed a new ecological niche, and their populations thrived. We are descended from those agricultural and urban populations of the Neolithic, because they found the new way forward and exploited it. If some other population from the Upper Paleolithic started doing those things first, then we would probably be descended from them. So what are we missing today? What new opportunities are afforded by new technologies? We have social networking technologies, which allows us to find people of like mind. We can build communities based on intentionally aligned values in a way that no human society has been able to do. The social contract of classical liberalism is a myth. There was no such state of affairs when people decided consciously and rationally to forego some individual liberty to gain access to these benefits of society. But today, we actually can have explicit social contracts. And here, in our intentional community in the Ozarks, we do have explicit contracts that we're signing, and that's allowing us to cooperate and get along and benefit economically. We have lower cost housing here than other people because we used social networking technology to find a new economic path forward, and other people aren't doing that yet. And so we are the early adopters. We will be the ones to benefit from it. There are new paths forward right now that we're still not exploiting, that we should be thinking about. Of course, the flip side of these new opportunities is that as technology changes, new domains of warfare also open up, new domains of conflict. The constitutions of Western liberal democracies weren't ready to handle networks of migrants from the third world organizing to gain economic footholds in their host countries, to change the laws in their host countries. It is a form of demographic warfare, and it's not what the Westphalian Western societies saw coming. So sticking to the conservative, traditional, nationalist solutions to these problems is fighting a 21st century battle with 19th century tools, and it's probably not the way to go. Not that nationalism doesn't have merits or that we shouldn't remember what was beneficial about that political philosophy, but we have to be thinking in new ways today if we want to win in those new domains of conflict, and if we want to be the ones to take advantage of new opportunities that are opening up. So, I mean, traditional nationalism, of course, just trying to go back to the way things were. We don't like the migrants, so let's send them all back. That's attractive. It's very intuitive. Unfortunately, the anti-white elites worldwide are not going to have it. That's exactly what they expect you to do, and that's what they are working against. So you can put yourself in direct conflict with the agenda of the global ruling elite and face all of that pushback, or you can think of new ways of solving these problems other than the traditional mainstream 19th century political philosophy. So the anti-white elites won't cede to nationalist demands. They're afraid of nationalism. That doesn't mean, though, that nationalism is the only way to gain the upper hand. You want to play judo here. If they're moving in one way, maybe don't just directly oppose them. Maybe use their momentum in an unexpected way where all of a sudden, they've got what they wanted, but the result is not as advantageous for them as they anticipated. You should be looking for those sorts of moves. Another problem with nationalism is that the payoff threshold is super high. If you don't gain political control over your nation, if you aren't able to remigrate all of these people, if you aren't able to change immigration policy radically in the face of opposition from corporate interests, etc., then you won't really have tangible benefits to walk away with. Whereas if we, say, leaned into an intentional community movement in politics, if we developed a political theory that legitimated intentional community, a communitarian political philosophy, which of course is already a branch of political philosophy today that's well established, so you can build off of that existing foundation. Instead, we could gain benefits without displacing the current elite entirely. Obviously, if you're saying, I want to throw you out and take your place, they're going to fight you tooth and nail. But if you start saying, you believe in these liberal principles, well, here's a critique of those liberal principles where we agree with freedom of association, we agree with these basic notions of liberty, but humans are social creatures, we're not autonomized individuals. You can point to existing evidence in biology, organicist theories of biological cooperation and what's involved in that. You can point to principles in cybernetics. Information systems work better when the nodes are able to predict to a greater extent the behavior of the nodes around them. And homogeneous communities are more predictable for their members, and so information flows should be higher. There are all sorts of technical scientific arguments you can bring to the fore to say that humans are inherently social creatures and there is an organic type of human community that we should aspire to. There is a form of human community that we should aspire to. And that's what's missing from liberal ideology. That's a valid critique. It doesn't break entirely from liberal political philosophy. It develops it in a way that highlights the importance of ethnic groups, of cultures, and even leftist academics are advocating this kind of cultural freedom of expression. A genuine multiculturalism where we allow multiple cultures to exist. In that kind of ideological environment and legal paradigm where we get rid of the Civil Rights Act nonsense, we negotiate with elites to have sensible freedom of association laws and have economic incentives to drive intentional community construction, new infrastructure construction in more efficient ways, more resilient ways, where we are independent and we're not reliant on big manufacturing centers when local communities produce more of what they need. The elites are already talking about the 15-minute city idea and the smart city idea. Well, that can be used for top-down control if we are drawn into it unwillingly. But if we develop a coherent political platform for ethnically homogenous, intentional communities, then we can benefit from some of these trends. So you don't have to put yourself in direct opposition to existing elites. You could even benefit from net migration into your country. Yeah, we would rather have the US as a majority white nation, but if that's not possible, demographically, if that's simply not going to happen, then how can we benefit from immigration that does come here? Well, we can engage in brain drain of China and other competitors. We want to be able to beat China. Well, okay, maybe we do increase the population of the US, bring in high-skilled, high IQ workers to make us more powerful, to increase our property values. If at the same time we build resilience against the negative sides of immigration, then we can have the pros without the cons. If we get the government to subsidize intentional community formation and negotiate with them to take away some of this anti-white, really unconstitutional legislation, and I think there is a clear legal path forward to do that, and it's a winnable battle because people can sympathize with that more than they can with, we have to send them all back and make this an all-white country. That is not palatable for the average American. Whereas allowing people to associate how they want and maintain their cultures that are like integral for maintaining their individual health as well, that's, people can sympathize with that. People can understand that. So if the government subsidizes those intentional communities and you get, a 500 square mile area that is ethnically homogenous, that has an explicit social contract, that fosters community development and social mindedness and positive values and high fertility, because we have, the infrastructure of civic life, walkable cities, we have community centers, we have a way of economically sustaining ourselves that's, beneficial for family formation. If we intentionally design these small scale communities, intentional communities, then does it really matter all that much if there's more Chinese people in San Francisco? Are you going to deal with that on a daily basis? You will benefit from increased property values. You will benefit from the military becoming more powerful potentially. You'll benefit from just the knock-on effects of having wealth entering into the US. But you'll be immune to the cultural degradation because you'll be creating more intentionally designed, organically scaled communities. With traditional nationalism, one of the problems is why the scale of the nation state exactly? Why not more the scale of the Greek city-state, the polis, something that's walkable, something where we can conceive of the number of people involved? So, yeah. With traditional nationalism, the anti-white elite are predicting your behaviors. They're preempting them with predictive programming. I mean, you're, as a white nationalist in the US, like the number one terrorist watch list suspect by default. So maybe don't put yourself in that category unnecessarily if you can gain the benefits that you need to gain and preserve your people and create a future for white children in other ways. The payoff threshold is very high. Current trends don't suggest that there is the possibility of a nationalist victory for white Americans. Maybe in some European countries it's possible. I don't know which ones. I don't know the intimate details. But in general, You can't just extrapolate that more Europeans are frustrated with immigration now, and therefore that trend is just going to continue ad infinitum, because there are hard biological limits on who will be sympathetic to nationalist messages. There are hardwired liberals, hardwired conservatives, and not in the sense that I was talking about at the beginning of the video, but in the height sense, where there are people who care about equality and fairness more than other things. And then there are conservatives who care about purity and loyalty and these other things. And those traits are heritable. So there are biological limits on who will be sympathetic to nationalist messages. You can go from, 15% to 30% support for remigration, but you're not going to go to 90% support, A, because some of these European countries are already 30% migrant themselves, and they're not going to be anti-migrant. And B, because a certain percentage of the native population will simply not be temperamentally susceptible to nationalist ideas. Another problem with traditional nationalism is that it is weak against international networks. That's probably why the National Socialists lost in World War II. You can't just focus on what's happening in your nation when there are people who are thinking globally, who are cooperating globally. That's why I think by coming up with a political platform that is universal human rights of community, the right to belong to community, that's very defensible philosophically. There are many scientific and metaphysical even arguments you can bring to the table there. And then you can use that as a moral legitimation of an imperial project that then shapes the world as a whole at a global scale to be more hospitable to these ethnically homogenous intentional communities that then preserves your people. And then the task simply becomes to build the best network of intentional communities so that your people thrives in a fair marketplace of such communities. And luckily, our people have a great track record of building societies. We've done it all over the world for a long time. It's proven that we can do it. I mean, this is what's happening in South Africa. They have a legal framework that gives them the right to associate how they want, that gives cultural integrity, moral weight, and Orania is thriving, despite being in a country that's 90% Black African. Despite the majority in a democracy seemingly not being sympathetic to their goals, they have this constitutional legitimacy because their country was built on the right kinds of political philosophy to allow for it. So if we advocate for similar political philosophies, we can create safe spaces for white communities, potentially all around the world. And we can cooperate with the American elite that, let's face it, they already invested in this huge military-industrial complex. Anyone who's played Civilization or any real-time strategy game knows that once you've built a big army, you better use it because it's a sunk cost. You already spent your money, spent your resources on the tanks and planes. Use them. Otherwise, it was a waste. So the U.S. has this massive military-industrial complex. We de facto still are the world hegemon. We are the cultural hegemon. We're shaping thought around the world one way or another. Well, by showing the current American elites that they stand to gain by supporting intentional communities, because this gives them more resilient manufacturing. Right now there's a big trend, especially in the MIC, towards modular production. That helps in terms of security because the individual components, people don't know the whole design of what it's going into. They just build their little piece. It affords compartmentalization. So the security state, the secret societies in charge of our military can build what they want with impunity. So actually, these interests align. We can have reliable economic support, manufacturing that makes our country strong and the elites benefit. And also, lends itself to community subsidized infrastructure development. Our infrastructure is crumbling. We're becoming less economically efficient as a result. Supporting these networks of communities makes it cheaper for the government to develop infrastructure. Suburban infrastructure is highly inefficient. We can do more efficient civic planning that uses resources in a more intelligent way. So these interests can align. We can work with elites like Elon Musk and JD Vance who want to be technologically competitive. They want the highest IQ people around the world, and we can tolerate that. We can sacrifice, racial purity at a national level if we get cultural and racial integrity at the local level, if that's subsidized by the government. And it very well could be. If we repeal the Civil Rights Act and amend some of these ideas of human rights in a more communitarian direction, the possibilities really open up. We're able to do it now with Return to the Land because there are exceptions, even in the Fair Housing Act, that allow private membership associations to operate real estate that is ethnically homogenous and exclusionary. That's totally legal. Of course, you kind of have to jump through some hoops and figure out how to do it in the right way. And so that takes work. It'd be better if we could negotiate with elites to open up the legal framework there to not just allow, but to incentivize these communities. And then our people can thrive because we do really well in forging new societies. So, yeah, the other problem with nationalism compared to communitarianism is that with communitarianism, you can have communities legitimated of all sorts of constitutions. So if people believe in mixing races together, they can go ahead and do that. That's not going to harm the racial integrity of those who don't. And in fact, it'll increase the identitarian leanings of those who don't, because it's a selection mechanism where the people who don't have loyalty to your in-group leave the community and go, spread your genes vicariously elsewhere anyway, even if in a diluted form. And then meanwhile, your population becomes more and more identitarian, more and more loyal to the identity over time. So you can allow people to go and form communities of all sorts. Most people will form ethnically homogenous communities anyway. They just naturally do that. The lunchroom effect, So with nationalism, it's sort of coercively forcing people not to associate in those ways. And the liberal individualist response will be, well, you're saying nationalism is important so that nations can be free, but then the individuals aren't free to associate how they want. And, it is kind of a legitimate criticism. You have to then argue why the freedom of nations is more important than the freedom of individuals. And maybe that can be done, but it's generally not going to be persuasive. Whereas if you have a more open definition of the community, then you can allow homogeneity while not having to forcibly, coercively prevent heterogeneity. And the homogenous communities will probably win anyway. They usually do. So you will just beat your competitors. You'll create an environment where your competitors are weaker and you're stronger, and you're free to, continue pursuing your survival strategy for the benefit of your posterity. So, of course, there are also nationalist tragedies of the commons. Nation states, the number one priority is to defend their existence. That's why Israel has the Samson option. They're willing to sacrifice human existence if it increases their own probability of survival a little bit. This is just part of game theory. There are these collective action problems. Nations, a world full of nation states is not the most secure state of affairs. You need global organization. So, having a political philosophy that has a solution there is preferable. And the solution I'm talking about is using the imperial edifice that we've constructed as the American regime, using that to have a kind of original sense of nationalism, a herder nationalism that advocates for cultural autonomy and cultural freedom and integrity, we can push for that instead of individual hedonism and so forth and materialism. And we can do that informed by scientific theories and philosophical defensible ideas. It's not that nationalism doesn't have anything going for it. It's that communitarianism in a broader sense is more flexible, I think more philosophically defensible. And it also, by being imposed at a global scale by the US and NATO, by aiming to cooperate with the world hegemon, just changing their mind on the principles. Instead of spreading democracy, we spread sovereign communities, which is a more, again, flexible mode of organization. You don't want to have to defend the nation state as the default natural, large-scale human society. There are other forms of societies that we should be able to experiment with also. You want to let 1,000 flowers bloom, try a bunch of different things. Don't just assume that, well, nations are natural, therefore they're good. That is a naturalistic fallacy, and people won't go for it, and they're not going for it en masse. Some people are, but those are the people who are biologically disposed to lean that way politically anyway. So we have to think of new paths forward that the people who are not inclined towards nationalism aren't going to immediately react against. They might actually see the merits in it, and then nationalists get what they want anyway. We need to look for those sorts of solutions. So there's basically two steps here. One, you set the stage internationally and at a national scale legally. You advocate for the political philosophy and legal apparatus that gives communities as much autonomy as possible, and which encourages governments to subsidize community formation because it makes your manufacturing resilient, because it makes infrastructure development cheaper. There are tangible benefits. And also, if you create, if you join this network of intentional communities now, then that gives you a voting block, that gives you leverage locally, that gives you, chips to throw in so that your negotiation has leverage. So yeah, you push at the national scale and international scale for the political philosophy of communitarianism and identitarianism. Use scientific arguments like we have been doing for racial homogeneity. Encourage that as a voluntary option. And then once that is established, with scientific reasoning and, philosophical integrity, then the job is to build the network, build the intentional community network that thrives, that succeeds. And there are specific ways we can do that. We can use social networking technology that, instead of enhancing, mimetic virality in content, which involves this polarization effect where people get into echo chambers and encounter a lot of confirmation bias. It also involves a kind of regression to the mean effect. Least common denominator ideas tend to be more viral because more people can understand them. Instead, we can organize according to social networking protocols that are intelligently designed to select for the most truthful, most useful ideas, and then the network itself contributes to building up a coherent worldview. Instead of here are the viral memes that are prevalent today, here are the talking points that are prevalent today. Instead, use technology, and I've talked about this with the Peer Academy idea. We're actually building the website for it now. Of course, we don't have a bunch of resources to throw at this sort of thing. We're relying on volunteers, and it's a slow process. If you want to contribute, you can donate paypal.me/airvol or donate on returntotheland.org for Peer Academy. We're trying to build it, but these are the sorts of options we have. These are the new technologies we have that we could exploit and be that new, Neolithic expansion population. We could be the ones who find the new way and exploit it. So with a social network that's built to raise up ideas that are worthwhile philosophically, scientifically, and then which saves the ideas and preserves them and puts them into a coherent worldview, a social networking site that has mechanisms for piecing together a more and more coherent, more and more scientifically defensible worldview, then we can operate on the basis of that worldview, use that to improve our protocols and create positive feedback cycles where we become more and more intelligent collectively. We have to exploit opportunities for collective intelligence that exist now that didn't exist in the past. That is the number one thing we can do. We can also integrate our education system into the way that we administer our societies. That's why it's a peer academy concept. It's not just social media. It is a way of organizing education as a lifelong process. So these are the sorts of ideas we could exploit that would give us the leg up. So we can actually work with a revanchist American empire. We can negotiate with the new tech elites. We can accept high-skill immigration and increasing the population of the U.S. to make it more competitive. We can weaken competitor nations like China. We can make America strong, put America first, preserve our ability to have ethnically homogenous communities that are safe, where we can raise our children. We can get the best of both worlds and provide something to the current elite rather than threatening them with displacement. If you say, I'm trying to take your job, they're not going to like you. They're going to push back and make it harder for you to do anything. And they're the ones who run the social networking sites and so forth. So, maybe there is a way of cooperating with them. I'm not saying you should do that in a naive way where you just assume goodwill on their part, but make yourself useful to them. And the number way I think that we can do that is to build that model of the new community. Join this intentional community movement, build up communities, build up a new kind of education system, demonstrate that it works, and then provide a voting bloc that they want to appeal to, provide an economic power base that they want to appeal to, and also provide the political philosophy that justifies their imperial ambitions. Maybe they don't care about the political philosophy themselves, but because they're just power seeking and that's why they're the ones in power. But if they can use that, they will, just like democracy has been a justification for warfare in various places. And sure, it's just a justification, and the true, real political reasons underlying it may be quite different. But if you have a more attractive political philosophy that beats out competitors because it's scientifically tenable and, intellectually coherent and everything, well, then you're useful in that way because they can cite your studies, cite your monographs, and that just allows them to build their power and yours at the same time, even if your goals are quite different. So you can work with the empire. You can potentially subsidize communitarian, intentional community, land development, revitalize the country economically. That's something we can do now, too. It would be more efficient if we had the backing of elites. We could really get moving at that point. But even now, we can do this. We can revitalize rural areas. We can also have communities in urban areas and afford economic opportunities. We can start new businesses in new ways. Potentially, if we make ourselves useful enough, we can negotiate with elites a policy, something like, the generational American credit, where, they recognize that by increasing immigration, we do kind of erode the cultural integrity of the nation as a whole. And so the heritage Americans deserve some compensation for this. And, perhaps we could get the idea going that if your grandparents were born here, then you get some kind of land credit that goes towards establishing an intentional community. Have a government program where you sign up with a certain number of people, and then the government, and you're one of these heritage Americans, then the government puts you, gives you a tract of land to develop and some assistance in developing it. And maybe that then also you have a leg up on the immigrants who they're coming here and benefiting the country to some extent, the high-skilled, high IQ ones. But then you, because, you are American and we should be loyal to heritage Americans first, then you get some benefit. You can push for an idea like that if you make yourself useful to the elites and have something to negotiate with. So we can be resilient against immigration ourselves and yet benefit as a nation from certain forms of immigration. And then by working with the regime to defend this kind of intentional community movement, we can have the moral high ground in allowing ourselves to create intentional communities everywhere, because we'll create a hospitable environment worldwide. By leading the world in preserving the ability to have communities like this, then we can benefit from that everywhere. White Americans, our property values will go up, our wealth will go up because the country is becoming more powerful. And then we can go and found communities in South America, in Africa, conceivably. We can have our own homogenous communities all around the world, and the new, actually virtuous American imperium can underwrite that and make that possible. So instead of the entire third world has access to our lands, but we don't have access to theirs, instead we have the wealth and power and skill to benefit from the entire earth. And we don't have to be coercive against indigenous peoples. I think the moves to get to that end state are all doable. Difficult, but doable. And I think it is a desirable end state. It's one that's not easy to conceive from the bat. It's unconventional. And it's not like I'm saying this is the only possible path forward. It's just something new, and we have to be thinking of new solutions. So contribute to this discussion in the comments. What do you think the merits are? What are the deficiencies of this idea? How could we improve it? We need philosophically coherent political views that elites can benefit from, that ordinary people can sympathize with, and which afford us a place to grow our own communities and protect our own children and posterity. So this is how I'm thinking we can go about it. What do you think? And regardless, we have to be looking for those new paths forward. People are innately very conservative in certain ways. So let's look at the new technological landscape, look at AI, look at robotics, look at social networking, look at new communication technology. How can we put it together to become more competitive? I think we're exploring that here with Return to the Land. You can join our project at returntotheland.org, join our private membership association. It is a private thing, not a public organization. In the future, though, if we work with those in power with a coherent philosophy that justifies it, maybe we can make this easier to do legally. We can make it a defensible idea that ordinary people support, and it's something that they will support more readily than mass, deportations or, coercively enforced racial segregation. No one's going to support that. And it's not even necessarily going to result in the best end state. The best end state I can think of is that we are free to use our ingenuity and creativity to build communities for our people all around the world that continue to grow, and in a way that also ensures the long-term survivability of the species, preserve our survival as a race, preserve the species, advocate for a global order that's virtuous, that allows people to thrive in their own organic setting, in communities of their choice. So, again, let me know what you think in the comments. If you do want to support, I put a lot of time into thinking through these things. And like I mentioned, there's no immediate payoff in original thought. I can't signal like I'm part of this tribe and then benefit socially. So if you want to help make this worthwhile, consider donating. I do want to dedicate more time to doing this. So anything helps. PayPal.me/Airvol. Or if you want to join my reading groups, we do classical philosophical texts. That's Patreon.com/Airvol. But yeah, thank you guys for listening. God bless America. Take care.